Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, How to Make Your Practice More Sex Positive. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A box that is located in the bottom center of your Zoom Windows taskbar. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical support questions during the presentation. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute website and will be emailed to you in the coming days. My name is Abby Gertzen. I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Saskatchewan Prevention Institute is a provincial organization. Saskatchewan is located on treaty lands 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and the homeland of the Métis. We acknowledge that our work is carried out with people from these lands. We are dedicated to moving forward on a shared path of reconciliation and partnership. We are all treaty people, and we are all grateful to live, work, and play on this land. Our mandate at the Prevention Institute is to help all children thrive through primary prevention and the promotion of well-being. We believe that children of all abilities have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. Our goal is healthy children. We provide education, training, and capacity building across 6 main program pillars: early childhood mental health, perinatal and infant health, prevention of child abuse and neglect, prevention of child injury, prevention of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and sexual and reproductive health. One focus of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program is to provide evidence-based information on topics related to sexual and reproductive health that is accessible to health and allied health professionals. This webinar aims to enhance our understanding of sex, sexuality, and gender through a queer, trauma-informed, and anti-oppressive lens. This session will cover the basics of sexual health from an evidence-based perspective, focusing on destigmatizing conversations about sex. We will also learn about the link between mental health and sexual health, along with various sexual, gender, and relational identities. Here to speak on this today is Celeste Sieferling. Celeste is a queer therapist, advocate, educator, and activist living on Treaty 4 territory. She has spent the last decade learning and unlearning about sex, sexuality, gender, and relationships in both her personal and professional lives. Her work is infused with intuition, humor, a belief that the world can be a better place, and magic. She is a mom, both step and bio, and has too many animals in her home to count. You are most likely to find her adventuring in nature or dancing in her heels, both providing healing in powerful ways. She hopes to help you find healing, wholeness, and reclamation wherever you find yourself. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Celeste. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Abby. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first professional thing back after having a baby. So my 8-month-old is inside with my sister, and I'm trying to not think about the fact that he might be upset. So also, like, my brain is still a little bit scattered. I have hormones racing through my body. We'll talk about things like that. So if at any point things don't make sense or you want clarification on anything, please let me know. Yeah, so like Abby said, I'm a queer therapist, I'm an advocate, I'm an activist, I'm on Treaty 4 territory. I work in the field of social work, so I work in a field that I'm critical of, but also that I love, and so it's an interesting dichotomy all the time. If you would like, I'm gonna talk about our land acknowledgement in terms of sexuality and gender. But if you want, you can introduce yourself and where you are and what treaty you're on, what lands you're on in the chat box, just so folks have an idea of where we're coming from. I am on Treaty 4, so it's the homeland of the Métis and also the lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota people. And I think it's common knowledge that a land acknowledgement isn't enough. It doesn't change the fact that colonization has happened and all of the harms that are associated with that. And so in this, I ask, like, what is your relationship with the land? What is your relationship with the Indigenous folks on the land? Where do you stand? Do you feel connected to decolonization in your work? What does that look like? For me, especially around things like sexuality, gender, and relationships, all of the ways that we have learned in Canada on Turtle Island, all of the ways that we've learned about sexuality and gender and relationships are deeply infused with settler colonialism. So a lot of the harms that we have survived and a lot of the sex negativity that we hold so deeply in our culture is from that settler colonial mentality. So when we're talking about decolonization, we're really starting to infuse, like, okay, what does this look like outside of settler colonialism? There are different ways that different nations and different Indigenous organizations and folks talk about sexuality and gender. And I think that's a really helpful way to get out of the sex negativity, the binaries, toxic monogamy, patriarchy, how patriarchy has informed relationships and how we view relationships, all of those sorts of things. So really starting to tease out what decolonization looks like in practice when it comes to sexuality, gender, and relationships. Just things to consider when we talk about the land and what lands we're on. So before I get into kind of some of the nitty-gritty, we're just going to do a quick check-in. So I know I am the only one talking, and you are behind a screen. You don't have to talk about sex, but just give yourself a quick check-in. Maybe take a breath, maybe drink some water, maybe feel your feet on the floor. Notice any feelings that are coming up, any urgency to be somewhere else. Notice what land you're on, what room you're in, who's around you, who's not around you. Just give yourself a minute to check in and to land here. And then from this place, so this is normally when I would do a circle check-in. I much prefer teaching in groups where I can see people's faces, but I'm happy to teach however I can these days. And so just give yourself a moment to think about what happens when you consider talking about sex, or when you consider me talking about sex for an hour. Does anything come up? Does anything shift? Any state of you? Does it feel different? Often the hard parts that come up around sexuality and sex and gender and relationships are the parts that intersect where we cause harm with the people we're working with, because it's our own reactions, our own judgments, our own biases that come up and get in the way of us responding to people from a more open place. So just take note if anything shifts in you, if anything twinges in you, if you have any reactions that feel off, just make note of that and just be curious about it for yourself. A lot of this work is unlearning work, and a lot of it is figuring out, I'm going to talk about biases and values in a second, but it's figuring out what's a triggered part of me or what's an activated part of me and what is authentically me and how do I want to show up for folks. So just be curious about those things, and you can talk about them with loved ones, with your therapist, with your friends, with your family later on to really tease out what's coming up, what's showing up for you. Okay, I'm not going to spend too long on this slide. These objectives they change all the time. There's so many iterations of what happens in my brain when I talk about this stuff. So these are kind of the things that I want to get out of today. I will give you my slides if you would like them. So you'll have all this stuff, so I won't spend too long on it. But I will note that there are some topics I won't talk about directly. So, STI prevention, birth control, that kind of like basic sexual health education piece. I took all of that out because I think folks generally have a sense of that, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it, especially from a shame-free, evidence-based perspective. I talk a little bit about sexual and gender identity, but I don't spend a lot of time on it. Any shame around sexuality, I touch on a few times. Consent, gender narratives, anything else in these realms that I don't directly touch on, please ask me if things come up. I'm happy to answer to the best of my abilities. Or think about it and then email you with an answer later on as well. Okay, so this is the place I always start from. And I separate values and biases because, as I mentioned, and I think we can all agree on, our world is sex negative. It just inherently is. Maybe your family isn't, maybe your close friends aren't, maybe you have bubbles that aren't, but the world at large, especially in North America, is quite sex negative. You watch any TV show, you spend too much time on the wrong side of Instagram or TikTok or Facebook. There are so many sex negative messages, and we'll talk about what that is. But so our biases are informed by the way we were taught about sex. Our values are different than that. So our values are the ways we want to show up in our work. Our values are inherent to us. Our values are what we want people to see and how we live in integrity. Oftentimes those two get jumbled up and our biases start to cloud our values. And especially in this kind of work, because it's so pervasive, the sex negativity that we live in, it's so pervasive that sometimes we get confused as to like, what is something that I value and what is something that I actually care about and what is a judgment that I learned from somewhere else. So we'll talk about some things around learning and unlearning and some examples of things that I've unlearned or I've witnessed other folks unlearning. But one example of this, just off the hop, so I worked in harm reduction. That was one of my first jobs. I didn't give a background of my work, but I don't think that's important. But I worked in harm reduction in Vancouver, and one of the biggest struggle points for a lot of folks was how do we support people who are pregnant while they're still using? Because it touches on, you know, this feeling of like, well, pregnant people shouldn't be using, they're harming their baby, blah, blah, blah. All of these judgments come up. But then when you root back to your values, so I would root back to my values and say, okay, what do I care about? I care about meeting people where they're at. I care about providing the best care for folks. I care about people coming back and building that relationship. So based on those things, of course, I'm going to support somebody, even if they are using while they are pregnant, because that's the value. That's what matters to me. So I think like as soon as we start to tease these things out, it becomes apparent what we can work with and what we can't. And that's another big piece, is knowing what you're not available to work with and where you need to refer out so that you don't cause harm. So I name my values so that you know where I'm coming from. I think it's important to name that this is not where I started. I grew up in Saskatoon. I went to a Catholic high school. And so I like to say I'm a survivor of Catholic high school lack of education system. And part of that is like, ha ha ha, that means that I like was deeply ingrained in what virginity meant. And I kind of was scared of sex, and I was definitely scared of getting STIs. But it also meant that I didn't have an understanding of consent. And so that led, or healthy relationships. So that led to a lot of more harmful experiences. So, you know, when I experienced sexual assault and sexual harassment, I didn't have a narrative for that. And that actually was really quite harmful and quite traumatizing. Same thing, I was in a verbally, emotionally abusive relationship, and I didn't have language for that. So not being able to access real, honest, authentic, evidence-based sex education, relationship education has really harmful outcomes that aren't just rates of STIs and rates of teen or unplanned pregnancies. And so that is really where my work was born out of too, is, you know, we do the work that we maybe needed when we were younger, and this is a big piece of that. It came with a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, so I really have immersed myself in, you know, sexual health, sexual education. I worked in a lot of different places, queerness, relationship anarchy, all kinds of different relationship identities have shown up in my work. And a lot of this has come out of having like hard conversations and big conversations. So that's one of the biggest things I encourage you to do, is have conversations about these things that we often don't talk about. So sex, pleasure, abortion. And I will say that I have space for all sorts of opinions, around this stuff. I will happily discuss, where people are coming from in terms of harm reduction or abortion. What I do not have space for is hate of any specific kind of identity. So I will talk about abortion and the complexity around your feelings or thoughts or values around that, but I won't debate trans rights. So that's kind of the sticking point. But I do think it's important for you to know what values are guiding your work and showing up for you. I know that the social work code of ethics is not like a robust ethical guideline. So really, and I know there are folks who are not social workers who have different codes of ethics, but from my experience, a system code of ethics is not always going to fully align with you. So really getting clear on what your values are and how you show up in this work is really important. So you can consider this question. You can share about it in the chat if you want. You can make a note of it. But just thinking, how did you learn about sex? And some people will have had a great sexual health education experience. I did not. Mine was very shame-based. It was very, don't have sex until you're married. But that's not to say that a lot of folks did have a good education. I know that that's true. However, even if you had good education, you're still facing all of the sex negativity in the messaging of the world around us. And as a quick example of this, on my mat leave, do not judge me, I just watched all 10 seasons of Friends. I loved it when I was young, and so I rewatched it. Super sex negative. There's homophobia, there's transphobia, there's fat phobia, there's misogyny, there's everything you can imagine. And that was a pretty mainline standard TV show we all watched. Not we all watched. I say that, kind of flippantly, but this is an example of how much this becomes ingrained in us. And you'll start to notice these things as you pay attention to your language or other people's language. There's so much STI shame, there's so much fear, there's still fat phobia everywhere. All of these things sort of come up. So that's around what have we learned. What have you had to unlearn? So probably if you're showing up here, you've already started this process of unlearning, or you're curious about unlearning. I have a list. Some of these things are from me, some of these things are from folks I've worked with, and some of them are I asked my Instagram when I was creating this, what they've had to unlearn. So I just have a few examples for you to consider and sit with. So women's pleasure doesn't matter. That was a big one. That's the other thing is my sex ed and a lot of sex ed and a lot of messaging around sex is straight and penis focused. So women's pleasure doesn't matter. There's shame around masturbation, a lot of shame around masturbation, especially when we add in purity culture or religious aspects of learning. Sex is shameful. Only certain bodies deserve pleasure. That's a really big one too, is if you are not in the category of desirable, then you don't deserve pleasure. The double standard around slut shaming, which I'm pretty sure we all know at this point. Cis men, this is the binary gender, but cis men can have as much sex as they want with no shame. Cis women cannot. In that narrative, trans folks, non-binary doesn't even exist. STIs make you dirty. The first time is supposed to hurt for folks with vaginas. This is a lie. It is a lie. There's so many lies about the hymen. I have a really good TED Talk on it if you want it. Sex is only intercourse or penis and vagina. There are only two genders. There are only two sexualities. Women are just hard to get off, which, I mean, that was thrown away when they did a study of women in straight relationships and women in lesbian relationships. Straight relationships get off 30% of the time. Lesbians get off 75% of the time. So that throws that lie out the window. Men think about sex all the time. This one is harder to hear, but the lie that men can't get sexually assaulted. We'll talk about arousal non-concordance. You don't need to know that word, but we'll talk about that myth, that lie a little bit later on. Shame around STIs. getting off with a vibrator is bad and make it harder to get off with a partner. You know, all of these things that we're kind of taught about sex. That one's kind of a newer one to grasp. So just thinking about what have you learned? What might you need to unlearn? And what of those things were you like, interesting, I didn't even know that I had to unlearn that. So what does it even mean to be sex positive? So I've talked about our sex negative culture. Oftentimes people hear sex positive and they think, oh, you just want like everyone to be having like wild and kinky sex all the time. You just want to talk about sex all the time. Blah, 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 blah. No. So sex positive simply means that we would like people to be making the best choice for them, their body, their relationship, their life, their health, in terms of their sex and sexuality, relationship, and gender identity. That's all it means. So we're only concerned about whether there's pleasure, consent, and everyone's well-being is taken into account. And then there's authentic choice and the celebration of all bodies. That is a summary of what it means to be sex positive. So this can be like a check-in list for you when you're working with folks and they're talking about their sex or their sexuality. Are these things present? Are they experiencing pleasure, or do they want to experience pleasure? Is it fun for them? Are they getting something out of it? Is there consent? Is everyone's well-being, emotional, spiritual, mental, physical? Is everyone's well-being taken into account? Is everyone getting to choose, and are all bodies being celebrated? Those are the only things that matter. When we talk about sex, if you learned the bases or intercourse are the only things that sex are, I mean, obviously that's not true. If we have a more queer view of sex, there are a lot of pieces missing to that. I had a friend who, she went to university and was playing the game Never Have I Ever. She was 19, and someone said, never have I ever had sex. And she drank, and her friend looked at her and was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, I've never had sex with a penis. She was lesbian. And her friend was like, no, that doesn't count. But that's an example of like how pervasive this stuff is. And that was in like the late 2010s-ish that she was in university. So we can change our entire definition of sex. I really like just intimacy between two or more bodies, because intimacy doesn't have to be touching. So there's sexting, there's kink, there's all of these different things that don't involve touching. But it does include things like vulnerability, emotionality, connection. That's kind of wrapped up in intimacy. Sex and love don't have to coexist. I'm not gonna touch on that too much, but just as a side note, intimacy does not have to include love. This quote or this idea is from Sex Positive Families. I linked it here. They are a really wonderful resource for sex positive talks for all ages, and resources and books. It's really, really wonderful. Especially for those of us who are parenting and know that there's no sex ed being taught in schools right now, or very limited. This is a really good resource. And I like this idea that we have sex for pleasure more often than we do to procreate. This is so important when it comes to sex ed, because we're often talking about like prevention only talks about how do you not get pregnant, how do you not get an STI, but there's so much else going on. Different kinds of sex will have different kind of risks. So we have physical risks like STIs, but we also have like sexting has emotional risks. What if someone sees my photo? What if someone sees those messages? What if my heart gets broken? There's so many different kinds of risks when it comes to sex that we can expand on. So from this part of learning, unlearning, grappling with our biases, just a few things to consider. Make time for self-supervision. So self-supervision is just asking yourself some of these hard questions, teasing out what's coming up. If that gets too sticky and it's too hard to do it on your own, access supervision. So you can always email me if you're like, I just want to have a chat about this, something came up. You can always email me, or find someone who is who you're already connected to, who is easy to talk to about this stuff. Access supervision around some of these harder parts, especially when things are coming. Do your own learning and research. So this is something I learned, especially from like queer and trans community, is we don't want to spend too much time with folks asking about their experience so that for our own learning. So we don't need to ask about the way people identify if we can just Google it. If you can Google it, wait until after your time with them is over and then learn your own information. Do not make clients educate you, or clients or patients or whoever, students, whoever you're working with. Spend the least amount of time having them educate you, unless they really want to, which is a whole other thing. And then identify your own values. Okay, so let's jump into some things around where sexual health and mental health interact. So I think it goes without saying that if we have a healthy sex life, if we have good relationships, if we have a positive body image, if we're able to advocate for our treatment and our meds that fit our life and our bodies and our health, and if we feel seen and heard and understood in our identities, we will have better emotional and mental health outcomes. In all of this, in my whole talk about mental health and sexual health, one of the biggest pieces is I would like to get away from diagnosing sexual behaviors or bodies as wrong or bad or shameful or problems to be fixed. We are not here to diagnose sexual behaviors. We do, as professionals in lots of different health arenas and education fields, we do diagnose sexual behaviors, hypersexuality, hyposexuality, even fatness. Like, we diagnose all these things that are individual. And I would like to get away from that, because if we start naming a sexual behavior or a way that you're interacting with your body or a way that you're interacting with your relationship, if we start naming those as problematic, people are going to feel that shame and they're going to shut it down and be silenced about whatever is going on. And then we don't actually get to work with the parts that they're struggling with. So if we can get away from diagnosing anything around sex and sexuality, that would be really wonderful. Because we don't want our judgment to turn into their shame. Yeah, so we're paying attention to what people are reporting as opposed to what our judgments are seeing. So are they reporting that they're having too much sex or a kind of sex they don't want to be having, or not enough sex? Are they reporting that their relationship is harmful? Are they reporting that they're having a hard time in their body? Or are we saying that they are? Those are really important things to grapple with. And this shows up especially when we're working with teenagers or seniors, because we have a lot of ideas and opinions about the kinds of sex that teens and seniors should or shouldn't be having. But really, it shows up with everyone. Okay, so sexual health and medication. SSRIs in particular have a bad rap for changing our libidos and our bodies, because it's true, because they do. There are more that don't have as much of an impact on our sexual health. I know from reporting and anecdotally that folks just assume that they have to take that hit, that they have to take, okay, well, if I have to be on antidepressants, that means my sex life is just going to change because that's the only option. And that's not true. So I add this in because I think it's really important for us to know that we can help folks advocate for their own sexual health, or for you to be able to advocate for your sexual health. Because as we just heard, sexual health, when it is well taken care of, it has a positive impact on our mental and emotional health. So if we can advocate for these things, if we can stay connected to our bodies, stay connected to our sex lives and our sexualities and our partners and all of those things, that will actually have a more positive impact on our sexual health or our emotional health than the antidepressant alone. So know that you can advocate for something different if it's not working for you. The change can be positive or negative. So people have vastly different experiences on prescriptions. I know that psychiatrists will say, just give it some time, but you are allowed to say, this is really not working for me. And if you change your meds, the things will change. That's different if it's like I gained weight or my boobs got bigger. Those things won't necessarily change right away, but in general, the effects from the prescription will change. I add in self-medicating, because this is a harm reduction talk and a harm reduction approach, but also because it's a reality and people are doing it. So especially with microdosing psilocybin and with marijuana. Microdosing psilocybin, a lot of people are using this. A lot of people, I say this anecdotally, people that I see in numbers that are higher than what I would see in research right now. Folks are starting to use psychedelic microdosing to replace SRIs for depression, for anxiety. This actually has zero impact on your sexual health and your body. So that is just a thing to note, is it will not affect your sex drive. Marijuana is more complicated. It can either make us more anxious, it can make us more heady, but also it can help with pleasure and it can bring us back into our bodies in different kinds of ways. There's even like weed lube. Like there's different kinds of things, and suppositories for menstrual cramps. So there's different things to experiment with in that realm as well. So we can help people to experiment safely, so that they have a better sense of like how I stay connected to my body and how I stay connected to my sexuality. So just like they can positively impact each other, they can also negatively impact each other. So anxiety, depression, these things will affect our sexual life, our relationship life as well. Anxiety, if you think anxiety takes me out of my body, and so then the symptoms for our sex life will be things that disconnect us. So erectile dysfunction, trouble with orgasm, pain. We override our pleasure centers because we're so stuck up here. And then arousal non-concordance, which I have linked to, I think, a TED Talk in there. Arousal non-concordance is a fancy way of saying my brain and my body's arousal don't match. So earlier I said we had this lie that men can't be sexually assaulted, and that's like cis men. That was born out of how can you be sexually assaulted if you have an erection? But this arousal non-concordance tells us that our brain and our body can have a very different reaction, arousal response to a situation. The only way, I'm not going to talk about consent or the whole thing around consent, but the only way we have consent, the only way we know that somebody is into any kind of sexual act is if they say it. Our bodies can reiterate that, but it is from our brains and our mouths that we get consent. It is not from bodies. So vaginas can lubricate, penises can get hard, nipples can get hard, our whole body can react, but our brain can still not be in it. That is something that comes up with anxiety, but it also comes up in a million different ways, healing from trauma. So some ideas, and I have links to these, so I won't get too into them. But some ways, really, we just want to get folks more in their body in a way that feels manageable and safe. So with partners or even with friends, like it doesn't have to be sexual. All of this touch doesn't have to be sexual. It's just experiencing, how do I feel touch? How do I feel pleasure? How do I feel in my body in a way that I can come back down and think, oh, that feels okay. I can feel my feet on the floor. I can feel where I'm sitting on the chair. We want to start to get into our bodies in a way that feels safe and manageable, that doesn't spike us back up. So sensate touching is just like a tiered way of experiencing touch with partners. The 3-minute game, people have done this in workshops. It's a Betty Martin game. So it's not sexual by nature, and it's exploring this wheel of consent. There's 4 parts of consent. So serve, take, allow, accept. And everyone will struggle with one of those things more than the others. And so this is just a way to kind of explore, like, when I ask to touch you and you give me permission, like what parts are harder. But it is like a very intentional, how do you want me to touch you? How do you want to be touched? And how do you want to touch me? It's a very intentional game. We can also explore with our other senses. So seeing, smelling, touching, feeling, all of those things can bring us back into our bodies. And this just means take orgasming out of it. So often we get really goal focused, and as soon as we take the pressure off to have orgasm or not have orgasm, we can just experience pleasure for the sake of having pleasure. Okay, so depression is more that numbness. A lot of the symptoms will be similar though, except you add in things like decreased sexual confidence, low libido, low desire to go out and make new connections. Any effects of antidepressants, SSRIs, lack of self-care will affect our body. So if we're not taking care of ourselves. So treatment will look like starting with that self-care, starting with those things to build up a little bit more care in our bodies, a little bit more confidence. We can also, masturbation can be a really good one for depression. It doesn't require you to be with other people. It is a way to experience pleasure on your own. It doesn't have to be connected to an outcome. And then things like focusing on self-care, talk to your doctor if it is medication, exercise, use your voice, only have sex if you want to. This is what Betty Martin uses in her 3-minute game, which I'll give you all the resources that I talk about. Okay, another big piece that we see mental health coming up in is STI diagnoses. Because there is so much fear and shame around STIs, seriously, I think it's very hard to watch a movie without jokes about herpes. Like they're everywhere. And so of course people are having big reactions to these kinds of diagnoses. People have serious suicidal ideations when they are diagnosed with HIV or herpes. I mean, chlamydia and gonorrhea as well, but especially those two, because those two are like the big fear ones of like, I'm never going to get rid of this. They're super common. I don't know what the actual stats are now, but it is very common that folks will have genital warts or herpes. And so the more we can have non-judgmental, compassionate responses, the more we will take that fear and anxiety out of it. And the more we'll get people to go get tested, because one of the outcomes of those responses and that shame is that people don't get tested and they don't get the medical treatment that they need. And then we just pass on these STIs more often than we probably need to. Syphilis doesn't need to be as rampant in Saskatchewan as it is. It absolutely does not. But it came back because fear of the medical system, shame, stigma, people not getting tested, not having access to getting tests, all of those kinds of things. And now we're back to the syphilis capital of Canada. So just some, people will have fear of having sex again, trusting partners, all sorts of things. So we want to, just quickly consider what some compassionate responses would be. So again, you can take note of these, you can write them down, you can write them in the chat, but anything that's compassionate, that's non-judgmental, thank them for telling you, offer to go with them to the clinic if they need, reassure them, tell them that they're not dirty, anything that really builds relationship and builds trust and reassures folks. You're not dirty. You are going to have sex again. You are allowed to feel pleasure again. You will trust people again. I can help you, get the access to treatment that you need, anything like that. Okay, this one is also a big conversation, but hormone, if our world was structured around how cycles happened, especially in folks who menstruate, our capitalist world would look so much different. Our productivity would look so much different because our bodies go through cycles every 28-ish days. 28-ish days. There is a good podcast that I haven't listened to yet, but I have heard good things called 28-ish days. I don't think I linked that anywhere, but I will. That talks exactly about that if we're more connected to our cycles, and so for folks who don't menstruate, even having this knowledge, having the ability to ask people in your life about their cycles, that's a really helpful and important thing. Because one of the things that's coming up more and more is that PMDD, so premenstrual disorder, oh my God, I'll look it up later. But PMDD is being missed, but is also being more researched right now. So I have a friend who's doing her psychology degree, and she is actually on a study that is studying suicidal ideations and addiction being linked to PMDD. So PMDD will often just be diagnosed as depression or anxiety. But if you are working with folks and you hear them say things like, oh, you know, I feel really good most of the time, but every few weeks I have suicidal ideations. Every few weeks I get really depressed. Have them track their cycle. Just note what is happening in your body, because it will show up often that people are having more anxiety, more depression, more suicidal ideations, more relationship struggles at certain times of their cycle. So it's an important thing to know, especially when we're working with folks, because we don't want them to be lumped into a generalized anxiety or depression diagnosis, even though diagnoses are, you know, imperfect science and not all the things that we need them to be anyways, but it gives us more of a handle on what's actually showing up. The non-medical treatment is sleep, movement, diet, talk about your feelings, all of those sorts of things. And then the medical treatment is birth control or antidepressants, both of which have their pros and cons. They have a lot of symptoms. Some people love being on the pill, some people don't. You'll have a vast array of people, of different experiences with this. But it is just something to note. Similar with postpartum depression and anxiety, I can tell you from my own experience that yes, your hormones, you feel wackadoodle. But the piece that we often don't talk about with postpartum anxiety and depression is that a lack of support, an increase of stress, having to go back to work, considering work, having harmful relationships, all of those sorts of things actually have a bigger impact on postpartum depression and anxiety than we give them credit for. So sure, our hormones are doing lots of things, but if you have the proper support and you have access to things like rest and food and nutrition and all the socioeconomic determinants of health, if you have access to support, you are able to manage those hormones. Our bodies are able to manage those hormones. That's a part of what we are meant to do as people who can birth. So I talk about this because I think it doesn't get mentioned enough, that our hormones are obviously connected to our mood and emotions and sexuality, and they will have a number of impacts on things, but connected to, you know, the systems and the worlds in which we live. Okay. We'll get through most of it, I think. Okay, so just a note on neurodiversity. There has been in the past a big assumption that especially folks who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum just have no sexuality. And so they have been missed in education and any sort of realm around sexual and gender sharing of knowledge. This is obviously not true and has actually caused a lot of harm in folks who are diagnosed under any of the neurodiverse diagnoses. We do know that neurodiverse folks are more gender creative and expansive. The guess there is, you know, you're already not fitting in the box, so might as well play with gender and creativity there as well, and sexuality. Because we haven't given folks proper education, they can be more vulnerable to harm and more unaware of things like consent and body awareness and all of those sorts of things. There are actually no differences in libido between folks who are neurodiverse and folks who are neurotypical. Things to consider are sensory issues. So normalizing those, having people get a sense of like what their overstimulation is, giving them a voice for, you know, I am allowed to say no, I am allowed to take a break. I don't have to use that fabric. If condoms, side note on condoms don't change sex that much. But if you have a reaction to latex or to that material, like that is something to note, or any other sensory overstimulation that comes up, lighting, sounds, etc. You don't have to push through it. You are allowed to take a break. You're allowed to soothe it. You're allowed to name it with your partners. This also, and this is again true for everyone, but communicating about sex before you're having sex is actually quite important. And so for folks who maybe haven't had really good education around this, folks who have been told that they're asexual because of their diagnosis, just really getting in touch with how do I communicate my needs and desires and boundaries before I am in a situation, because we know as soon as we're in a sexual situation, it is way harder to communicate. Your hormones are going up and down. You also really want to stay connected to the person that you're potentially about to engage in sexual activity with. And so you're more likely to go along with what they want or what's happening as opposed to like reconnecting with yourself. So having, this goes for everyone that I talk to ever, having conversations about your needs and desires and boundaries and sexuality before you are in a sexual situation is so helpful. First date, talk about sex. Another thing that can be helpful is to have different tools for communicating. So flashcards, words, instead of full sentences, body signals and gestures, because sometimes, especially for folks who struggle to voice something in the moment, different ways to communicate can be really helpful. Yeah, okay. Bodies. This is the last thing I will talk about in terms of mental health. And then we'll see how much else I get through. How are we doing? It's so hard to not be able to see you, but okay, that's okay. Okay. So I will only make a few comments on bodies. I'm not going to talk too much about fat phobia. I am instead going to talk about body dysphoria, body dysmorphia. Yeah, I don't have to go on tangents here. Okay, so both of these are diagnoses in the DSM. Body dysphoria is often associated with transness. So this is my body doesn't match who I am. So my gender doesn't match my sex. My sex is you were born with a vagina, you get labeled a girl. My gender is I get to decide who I am based on how I feel on the inside. So body dysphoria is those two things don't match. It's trans men feeling anxious, depressed, dissociative, any of those things when they feel or see their breasts. This is not a mental illness, and there's a lot of problems with having this in the DSM because it diagnoses transness basically as a mental illness. It gatekeeps life-saving treatment. So gender-affirming care and surgery is often gatekept behind this diagnosis. So there's a lot of issues with this, but it's just a term for us to know. So when it comes up, we know what it is. And this is different than body dysmorphia. So body dysmorphia is often associated with eating disorders. And it is, you actually see your body as different than it is. So when you look in the mirror, for example, you'll be like, oh, I'm fat, but really you are shrinking away. You see yourself as defective, something to be fixed, unworthy, unlovable, and it's not based on your actual body, it's based on what you see or what you think you see. That is also a diagnosis in the DSM. There's also issues with that. The treatments are much different, like body dysphoria, gender affirming care is a very common and easy, not common. It's not easy to access, but it is something that as soon as people get their hormones, as soon as people get supportive care, as soon as people have access to any medical surgery that they need, you see anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations, you see those things shrinking away. Body dysmorphia is trickier because body eating disorders and our experiences of our body are much more complex. But a lot of, like a starting point for the antidote to these things is even talking about, okay, how is my body a resource? How can I not make my body the enemy? How has my body served me? So really pointing again to like those parts of our body that are actually good for us. Body neutrality is kind of a buzzword, or it has been a buzzword in the past little while. It's saying, if we can't get to body love, can we feel neutral about our bodies in the meantime? There's a lot of debate about that, but it's getting us out of that hate or that dysmorphia. It helps us to see our bodies for more of what they are. How can we have more compassion for our bodies? And then a question I like to ask folks who are not cis, so folks who are exploring their gender identity, is, when do you feel gender euphoria? When do you feel like yourself? These are some resources. I will give these to you. Okay, healing from sexual trauma. Yes, okay. So I like the word antidote because it's not treatment, but it's things that will counter the things that people are bringing. So choice, safety, pleasure, and rebuilding our boundaries. So often we know in sexual interpersonal trauma or harm or violence or abuse, choice is taken away. And that is one of the biggest factors of something being traumatic. Our safety is taken away. We don't feel like we can ever access pleasure, and boundaries are just out the window. Either our boundaries become too loose or too rigid, or a combination of both. So working with these four things can be really life-changing for folks who have survived sexual and interpersonal abuse. Giving people choice. This even is as simple, one of my somatic teachers taught me this. This is as simple as having people know what they like and what they don't like. Like, what kind of food do you like and what kind of food do you not like? Because choice and who I am and who I was taught I was supposed to be is taken away when, especially if there's childhood sexual abuse. I got confused as to what I liked and what I didn't like because someone was telling me that I was supposed to like this thing that actually did not feel good. So coming back into our actual center of, where is my choice? What do I like? What do I not like? Having them build internal safety. So that means, how do I know I'm safe? And what are some things that I can access when I feel safe? Reminding people that they can access pleasure, feeling even like non-sexual pleasure, like rubbing your hands with lotion. How does that feel? What is the smell you like? And then in rebuilding boundaries, there's a lot of boundary activities that we don't have to go into. Things to pay attention to. So again, we're not trying to diagnose anything around sexuality, but we are paying attention to what people are reporting. So if people are saying things like, I get so in my head when I have sex, this could be anxiety. It could also be a sign of dissociation. I don't know why this sexual act bothers me so much. Oftentimes we have triggers around certain sexual acts. I really want to want sex, but I don't. I seem to want sex even when my brain is telling me to stop. I have to be high. I feel like I can't trust them. So they have a trustworthy partner all of a sudden. And we've worked on a safe and trustworthy partner, but they still feel like they can't trust them. That's your body reacting to something. And I almost feel too scared to orgasm. All of these things are just things to pay attention to that might be symptomatic symbolic of something else going on, especially when it comes to survivors. So help them connect with their own body. This is really big. Trying to help them find out when they leave their body. This can be information if they're dissociating. Dissociation is a really big thing when it comes to survivors of especially childhood sexual violence and abuse, because that is the way that they kept themselves safe. If you have questions on that or it doesn't make sense, just let me know. But so if you can find out what is triggering them to leave their body, you can work on that specific point of sex or sexuality in a relationship, in a safe relationship, or in your therapeutic relationship. Bringing a partner in can sometimes be really helpful if they do have a safe relationship. Having someone come and witness can be really profound and really helpful. Focus on pleasure, not orgasm. Go slow and focus on self-care. Okay. Oftentimes parents will have big reactions when their kid hits a certain age where they experienced sexual abuse. It might be confusing. They might not have any idea what's going on. It can look like being super overprotective, not letting their teens go out or their young people go out, having big reactions to things like them dating or kissing or what they wear or what they don't wear. Feeling really fearful and really controlling. What will come out of this eventually is that there's also grief. There's grief that you didn't get the safety and protection that you are giving your kid now. So there's a lot of pieces there. So if a kid, this is twofold. So if a young person you're working with is like, why are my parents so controlling, blah, 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 blah. It is worth you noting. You're not going to bring that up to the parent, but it is worth you noting that maybe there is something else going on. Perhaps, perhaps not. But maybe some family counseling would be helpful. And then parents, same thing. If they're reporting their big fears, it might come out that they disclose something around their own childhood. And then some ways to, even just having this framework can help us to support those people. These are some resources. Okay, I have 2 minutes. I'm just gonna, okay. Identities, there are lots of them. Get curious about them. The best things we can do, trust people when they tell us who they are. Don't try to tell people who they are or what they are. And these things are all fluid and they're all going to change, and it's okay that they all change. I can and would do a whole talk about non-monogamy. There's a lot of different ways to be non-monogamous. And there's a lot of things that will come up when people open up their relationship. So a lot of people will seek support when they are opening up their relationship. Notice your own reactions to non-monogamy, as those will come up and come out when you're supporting people, especially like your friends or people in your life. Someone will be like, I'm not monogamous. And then there's all of these layers of judgment and criticism that show up. So just pay attention. These are things. So when I say toxic monogamy, it is what has come out of a patriarchal society in which monogamy was really born out of this idea that men owned women. That's like a very easy way to say it. But so there's all of these things that now show up as normal in relationships, normalizing that jealousy is a sign of how much I love you. That love is enough. We hear that all the time. Love is enough. No, it's not. That you should be able to meet your partner's every need. The best thing you can learn from non-monogamy is you already have multiple people in your life that meet multiple needs. So why are we putting so much pressure on a romantic relationship? I linked to Alok. They're really beautiful, lovely human. They are trans. They talk about relationship anarchy. Just get to know them. I really love this quote. We should be able to talk about seeing our friends and celebrating with them. I have a best friend, love, far away, and we talk all the time about having like a commitment ceremony. Okay, the only thing I want to say right now quickly about kink and BDSM is that kink can help heal trauma when it is done consensually and in a safe place. It can be really, really, really helpful. There is an article, I don't think I linked the article, but there is an article that I can't access because I'm no longer in the academic world, but that actually studied how kink and trauma, how kink can be helpful in healing trauma. And then just a note on our continual attempt to destigmatize sex work. Sex work is not human trafficking. Those two things are not the same. Folks do choose sex work. They do find it empowering. The biggest concerns are criminalization, stigma and judgment around it, safety concerns, and lack of benefits. Those are some resources. Sorry, I went real quick at the end, but that is it. Okay. Uh-oh. Stop share. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Celeste.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope, that's okay. We're all good.
I don't have any questions in the question box, but I will just remind everyone if you have anything now or if you have anything that comes up later, I will share a link to Celeste's email in the chat box. You can send her an email later if you want with any further questions. I'll just leave a moment for people to ask questions if they have any, and then we can wrap it up. Or if there's anything else that you want to chat about a little further, because you did fly through the end.
It took me really quick. But I don't think so. Oh, the one, okay, I'll say one more thing because I really liked this in terms of identity. And really, this can be true of any kind of identity or anything else that's going on in people's lives, not even around sexuality. But the difference between being an ally and being in radical solidarity with folks, I like the term radical solidarity a lot. And I have a photo somewhere. But basically, ally is like, I support you from afar and I can cheerlead you. Whereas radical solidarity is like, I am in this with you and I will show up for the collective good. I will put myself on the line. Often we use our power. So I am a cis woman. I would use my power as a cis woman to show up for trans folks because I have more safety oftentimes in a lot of different spaces than they do. So we leverage our power, we take risks. This idea that liberation for one benefits us all. We're not free until we're all free. It's true. And so if we start to see that like we are connected to everyone's struggle, then I think the whole world would change. Yeah, but this idea of like be radically solidarity? No, that doesn't make any sense. Radical solidarity, which is also like the term, you'll hear people say accomplice versus ally. It's a similar thing. Okay, now I will stop talking. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating in my first training back after having a baby.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation, Celeste. It was very insightful. A couple people have thanked you in the chat and said great session. I don't see any questions, so I will wrap us up.
Cool.
I will send out an email with the resources and links that you mentioned sometime this week or next week. And then once we upload the recording on the website, I will also send that out to everyone. And Celeste's email is in the chat if you have any further questions, and her website is also there. When you close the window, you'll be directed to a link where you can complete a short survey of the session, and that just helps us with planning future webinars. If you have time, we would really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much, Celeste.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming.